You know, at Equidad ATX, we value co-creation and collaboration. We try to embody the African proverb that says, you want to go fast, go alone. But if you want to go far, go together. Our three panelists that I have the pleasure of meeting and you're going to hear from embody that. They show the impact of strategic partnerships. They show the impact of the theme for this panel, of course, is called Will You Be My Neighbor? They show the impact of what happens when we stretch across fences and particular barriers and form coalitions to achieve a greater goal than we could by ourselves. So with that, let me introduce or bring up to the stage Audrey Aradanas, who's the Deputy Director for Miami Homes for All. Let's give a hand to Audrey. We have Noerena Limón, who is the CEO of Casita Coalition out of California. Noerena. And then we have Stephen Menendian, who is the Assistant Director and Director of Research for the Othering and Belonging Institute at UC Berkeley and the California Zoning Atlas. Stephen, welcome. All right. Now, I'm not going to share their bios, which are very impressive. They are linked to the materials that you have. Please read them, and there's some materials also associated with their bios. I'm expecting after you hear from them that you'll want to connect with them, and they'll want to connect with you to share their thoughts and experiences, their challenges and opportunities, and see how we can bring some of their learnings here to Central Texas. There's no sense in us reinventing the wheel as we look at housing and affordability issues here in Central Texas on a regional basis. All right, with that said, why don't we start off with a basic question. This talks about you all are working to address housing affordability in different manners. But you're doing it, as we've noted, on a regional basis, as opposed to the way we typically have done it, which is so localized, et cetera. And can you share the frame from which you're looking at the housing issues in your work, and also what you're doing to tackle them from a, let's say, a 50,000-foot level to start off with, and then we'll drill down. And we know that framing is so important as we're looking at tackling issues. The way we frame it can help direct us either to a resolution that is impactful or one that is not so much. So talk about, Audrey, how you started framing your issues and some of the work you're doing there in Southern Miami, or Southern Florida.
Awesome. Thank you so much to the HousingWorks team. What an incredible room here today. I'm so inspired by each and every one of you and the speakers that you've all had. Let me just paint a picture for all of you. So Miami, like Austin, we're cousins, right? We're very similar in terms of the challenges that we face and how we are trying to address the lack of affordable housing and homelessness in our communities. So in Miami-Dade County, there are 34 municipalities. In Broward, there are 31. In Palm Beach, there's 39. And what we found was that in South Florida, we're faced with this issue of like the state and others. We're kind of in a hot seat right now in Florida. I don't know if you noticed that, like Texas. But there's this idea that we have to silence ourselves and we have to reframe how we use our language. So even though Florida has experienced a lot of natural disasters, economic crises almost every day, we have an influx of many people that are now vulnerable of being displaced, whether because of their immigration status or otherwise. But yet, we can't say resilience. We can't say that we have to, instead of saying that we need to preserve our homes, what we've learned is that we have to say harden.
So let me interrupt you for a second.
Go ahead.
When you say we can't say, some of us may be missing. You're not saying that we're choosing to use a different word. you're saying you're prohibited from using.
That's right. That's right. And so we are kind of we're kind of tied to, in terms of like how we frame our advocacy, because we are a super, Miami is interesting, right? And I'm sure, Austin is very similar in this regard. So we have a 60% Hispanic population. I was telling the folks here earlier today, you can't survive Miami without speaking Spanish. I myself am fluent, right? It's actually mandatory in our schools that you speak Spanish. And yet, there's this disconnect, right? Of that, we have a lot of, recent migrants, but yet there's this lack of focus of ensuring affordable housing for these populations. And we still quite can't figure that out. And so what we've done is, in order to reframe our advocacy efforts, we had to really look at the economic impact. And we had to totally do a lot of research that you all are already doing here in Greater Austin, but we had to do that in order to educate our decision makers and our stakeholders on what do we mean by our workforce? What do we mean about our residents? Because there's this sense of othering in our community. And so we had to do a lot of that, and we had to show them and partner with our local institutions to kind of paint the picture that there is a 90,000 gap right now, just in Greater Miami, in affordable housing units. There's no way we can build ourselves out of that within a short amount of time. And so there's this sense that, we can't talk through resiliency efforts because climate change is not real in Florida. We can't talk through, immigration because, I'm not gonna talk about that. And then we can't talk through homelessness because homelessness is seen as a choice. And I'm sure that's kind of a similar theme here in Texas. And so in order to kind of totally revamp our advocacy strategy, we had to come up with creative ways of partnering with unlikely partners, and I'll talk more about that later. And yet, so all of this to say, just to kind of go back to the question here, sorry, I go on tangents a little bit.
Good.
We really had to figure out what does the powers that be, what do they really care about? They care about money, they care about their businesses, and they want to make sure we look good. Miami has a reputation of being a party city. I'm sure, anyway, everyone knows that. A party city, beaches, and all of that. So we had to really say, and frame it for our elected leaders and our decision makers and our stakeholders, how do we preserve what Miami is known for? And that really helped us move our advocacy forward in terms of totally reframing how we did that.
That's good. Thank you, Audrey. Noerena, tell me what Casita's coalition is doing and how you're framing the issues you're facing.
Sure. Well, first of all, also, just many thanks for the invitation to join all of you today in this wonderful conversation and group of folks that are committed to addressing our affordability crisis. So the Casita Coalition is a organization based out of California. We are an organization that has a broad coalition with a national presence, but we know that to add more affordable units to our communities, we need to build the middle. We focus on middle housing as an approach. We've been studying what Austin has been doing around middle housing reforms, and it's truly impressive.
So for those who may not
what
be
does middle housing mean?
Please
Yeah, I know that was coming. And what you were talking about, language is everything in the work that we do. So middle housing is referred to anything between a single family home on a lot and a high rise. So we're talking accessory dwelling units, townhomes, duplexes, triplexes, cottage courts, even small condo units with 3 stories. We're talking about infill housing that was restricted to us because of the overemphasis on the single-family white picket fence suburban neighborhood that has created really the crisis that we have right now, where there are not enough homes. In California, we've been faced with the affordability crisis and the housing shortage for longer than many other states around the country. So it reached a critical mass for us where it was visible. I mean, Los Angeles is the homelessness capital of the country. So the concept of having to do something around our housing crisis was very urgent. And what happened is that an incredible coalition of advocates, business people, equity orgs, just organizations throughout this, just unlikely allies came together to do something about our housing crisis. And the Casita Coalition is very proud. We were the organization that was behind what is now considered the ADU revolution in California. We were the first state to pass a statewide ADU ordinance. So in the state of California now, you are allowed to build almost up to 4 units if you think about it. So what does that mean? You can convert an internal space. You can create a JADU, so that means maybe a converted garage or something like that, and a separate detached ADU. So in reality, you can build up to 4. You can have 4 units in any single-family home throughout the state. That actually came before what we've seen, for example, here in Austin. We've seen in Texas, you see cities coming up with these incredible advances. We did statewide first, because there was an understanding that there was so much, another word we can't say, NIMBYism, but there was so much failure for cities to really address this issue that we knew that the only way was going to pass a statewide reform. So that is, has led to probably the most successful housing policy out of California right now, and we've now seen an increase of almost 450% in ADUs since the start of our reform in 2016, 2017. So very successful, but the framing is critical. And the way that we did it was, and I've been studying the fact that Texas tried to pass a statewide reform, and our winning campaign was, well, local control begins at home. You have no right to tell me what I can and cannot do with my backyard. And that was really the winning strategy for us.
Okay. Well, we're going to come back because I want you to talk more about the impact and the numbers, not just in California, but what you're seeing across the nation, et cetera. And I think Florida, Audrey, is even copying some of the...
So I'm so glad we connected, because I was actually very inspired by California, but we just had to take California out. Whenever we met with our elected officials, we never said California. But we said other states are doing this. Other big states are doing this too. And we know this could work, but we never mentioned California. We actually did mention quite a few cities in Texas, but we never mentioned California. And that was how we were able to be successful in passing our local ordinance and regional ADU ordinances. And right now, there is a statewide ADU bill, hopefully, that will pass in the next couple of weeks. And so I think what we did was that we took a lot of things that California is doing and just sort of removed that and reframed it of like how it would work in Miami-Dade County, in South Florida, and in the entire region. And so it was pretty instrumental to do all that.
You've got to adapt the strategy for your locale for it to be successful.
And I got more to say on messaging, but I don't want to take up all this.
Stephen, good to have you here with us. Talk about your framing, and I'm really intrigued about the Othering and Belonging Institute, and Audrey, when she was talking about the issue of othering there in Miami. So talk about the framing that you're doing and some of the work.
Well, thank you, Ashton. Thank you, Audrey, Marina. It's wonderful to be here in this strange and perilous and interesting time, and this moment in our history in the middle of Texas. I'm also from California, but I'm originally from the Midwest. And that actually really informs how I think about these issues. There's a buzzword that's been going around called the poly crisis, and I think it's actually really important to think clearly about how we define the problem. So Audrey made the point on conceptual clarity. When you think about the housing crisis, how do you define it? Because I would suggest that there is more than one crisis.
Yeah.
And coming from the Midwest, I came from, and the Northeast, doing work in the Northeast, I came from a fair housing civil rights tradition. And then moving to California, the frame was completely different. The frame was mostly on affordable housing, not fair housing. And I just want to just sort of ground, how I think about this. The slide's not advancing. Let's see. There we go. So first I want to draw two distinctions. The first is between affordable and fair housing. So I think that these terms are frequently and too frequently conflated, so I'm going to be a little bit challenging, maybe even a little difficult in pushing you to think about this clearly. So fair housing generally refers to issues of identity, discrimination, segregation, and integration, right? But affordable housing really refers to the provision of housing for low-income and very low-income people. And I think in terms of policy, these are actually very different policies. So you can just think about this for a moment. You can actually, in theory, solve the affordable housing crisis without solving the fair housing problem.
Exactly.
Or vice versa. If that's theoretically possible, that means these problems, no matter how entangled, are nonetheless conceptually distinct. So the typical policies that we have for affordable housing are either subsidized housing, demand or supply side, think LIHTC or Section 8, or filtered housing, that sort of naturally occurring affordable housing. But fair housing policies are very different. They're typically ordinances or statutes that prohibit discrimination, or things like AFFH that require affirmatively further fair housing in federal agencies and so forth. I just think it's really important we keep these distinct, because a set of policies that advance one might not advance the other. A parallel might be the fight over affirmative action in higher education. If you just replace race with class, you do not actually generate a lot of racial diversity, no matter what Rich Kallenberg says. Modeling on this proves it. If you replace a race-specific higher education admissions policy with one that's just on class, the modeling shows you get about a third to a quarter as much racial diversity. So it just can't be used as a proxy for that. And then the second thing I want to just draw a distinction is between affordable housing and housing affordability.
Yeah.
I can't tell you how crazy it drives me to see journalists use these terms interchangeably or conflating them. Affordable housing, again, refers to generally people who are low income or very low income. Housing affordability, as you can see on my slide, refers to median or average price of homes. So you can, again, solve one of these problems and actually make the other one worse. So the median price of housing can go up, 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 even as you are creating more affordable housing units, like was on the slide earlier, right after lunch. And then there's a set of other problems. Homelessness, right? We now have record homelessness. The most recent count in December was 770,000 people in the United States homeless. California is top 3 worst states in the country on each of these problems: housing affordability, lack of affordable housing, homelessness, you name it. But you can actually create, like New York City does, a whole system of sheltering and still have worsening problems on the other dimensions. So we really need to be conceptually clear on what we are trying to address, how we understand the problem, and then what levers we're going to pull to solve those problems, with an understanding that solving or even making headway on one might not only fail to address another, but could actually make it worse.
I appreciate that, Stephen. And I also appreciate you talking about, when you were talking about the distinction between fair housing, and you were implicitly talking about the fact that we have to deal or acknowledge the institutional racism and segregation that's part of that. That if you solve for one, you won't solve for the other. So I appreciate that. Let's talk about jurisdictional fragmentation for a minute. Why is it critical to address these issues of affordability and housing cooperatively at a regional level?
So Audrey mentioned that in the regions in Florida, you have over 30 jurisdictions in each of these regions. There was an interesting article by Connor Doherty in the New York Times just, I think, posted yesterday about sprawl. And typically, for decades now, sprawl has been denoted as this problem. And I myself have seen sprawl as a problem. But when I read Connor's article, I realized it's not sprawl that's the problem, it's fracturing. It's jurisdictional fragmentation. The average number of municipalities per metro region is over 30, and it's been that way for decades now. Some jurisdictions have far more, some regions have far more, some have far fewer. In the Bay Area, the 9-county San Francisco Bay Area, we have 101 municipalities plus 9 county governments. That's 110 jurisdictions. In LA, the 6-county LA region, there's over 180 municipalities. In the Cincinnati region, there's over 30. What does this mean? What this means is that you have 30 potential PHAs, you have 30 police departments, you have 30, it creates and facilitates opportunity hoarding. So if you solve a problem in one municipality, so Berkeley decides to upzone, it does not solve the problem regionally. No. In fact, it leaves the problem to other cities in the region to sort of fill the gap. So jurisdictional fragmentation is the problem of the fracturing of municipal governance across regions in ways that facilitate and exacerbate economic inequality, municipal stratification, racial and economic segregation, opportunity hoarding, and structural racism. That's the key mechanism. And what you get are these municipalities that want to secede, right, like Gardendale or Jefferson County or Buckhead out of Atlanta. And so I have a couple statistics here. Already mentioned this. The Midwest is actually the worst in this, the Midwest and the Northeast. They tend to have the most number of jurisdictions. The metropolitan region of Pittsburgh is actually by far the worst. It has 463 local governments overall, which is 1 for every 5,000 people in the region. And there's actually a link here where you can see, it should be 5,000 people. There's a link here where you can actually see a list of municipal fragmentation per capita on this link. But jurisdictional fragmentation is one of the most pernicious structural problems we have that relates to housing infrastructure and well-being in the United States.
You mentioned a little bit about it leads to trying to succeed. And what has your data shown? What happens when communities have done that? What have we been left with?
Well, what happens is usually whiter, more affluent communities want to secede from larger urban areas and take the tax dollars with them. And that means that the jurisdiction that's left behind is poorer, has less fiscal capacity, is more fiscally constrained, and then can't solve problems around water, sewer, infrastructure, let alone provide other things like for public health or public transit. So again, we see this all over the place. I think I have some data here. Let me just pull up the main slide. Here it is. Between 2000 and 2017, there were over 120 attempts to secede from larger jurisdictions, 47 that were successful. And there's still ongoing litigation over some of these attempts. They're in states, Georgia, Louisiana, all up and down the country. This is a huge structural problem. Again, these housing problems, are not confined to a single jurisdiction. They're regional problems, they're statewide problems, and they're national problems. You cannot solve it purely at the local level. That's what this entire conference is about.
Exactly.
And so we need to think about it. A regional problem requires a regional solution.
Yeah.
Right? You can't solve it at the local. Berkeley cannot solve the Bay Area's problem. Just cannot. So I'm pointing this out, this problem of fracturing and fragmentation, and I'm going to get to the solutions in a bit, but I'm just pointing out that this is the problem. We have to be clear on problem definition if we're going to actually pull the right levers to solve it.
I appreciate that, thank you. So let's talk about Casita Coalition and what you all have done in working through this issue of the middle missing. And how do you, first of all, you define that, thanks very much for that.
Although I have more on that.
Good, I'm glad. And also ADU may not be known to everybody, so if you'll define that term. And then further, what political infrastructure is needed for successful zoning reform similar to the work that you're doing?
Yeah. So first of all, I defined what middle housing was, and one of the things that often gets confused is that we think of, when we say middle housing, we're often thinking middle income. And that also becomes really confusing. And yes, many middle income families can find housing through middle housing, but we're talking about the types of housing. The housing that has existed for a very long time, like townhomes and plexus and the like. It's really interesting in this space because it all becomes a messaging game. And you spoke about, the things that we can say, that we can't say. What are we? Are we the, what is the pro-more housing movement? Are we, like you said, there's affordable housing, but I always have to ask, are you talking about capital A affordable housing, or are you talking about making housing more affordable? And that gets confusing. Is it the abundance movement? Is it the YIMBY movement? No, there's bad connotations to saying the word YIMBY. Never mind, let's just say something like, gentle density. But don't say gentle density because, density is also a trigger word. So really we have our work cut out for us in terms of how we frame this problem that we all see. We know that we need to ensure that we unlock all of the 70% of housing that's been locked out because of single family zoning. How do we create, more housing there in a way that doesn't scare people? That is kind of the name of the game. You talked about, not mentioning California, which is something we've developed a national coalition because, like you said, we can't do this alone. This is our pro-more housing movement happens with all of us learning the best lessons, not reinventing the wheel and learning from one another because housing has regional impact. The fact that California has such a housing crisis has impacted Texas. It's impacted Arizona. It's impacted, and we are seeing just the fact that people are moving to find places that are more affordable. I mean, we're seeing places like Mexico City. We're seeing places like Lisbon also experience displacement because Americans are moving to these cities because of our affordable crisis. When Montana, a red state, was passing their statewide EDU bill, they framed it as, don't California my Montana. And that was the winning strategy. And that is what we work with other localities, with states and cities to make sure that we're utilizing the values of the community in passing legislation that resonates with people. So that is a critical part. How do we ensure that we have human stories behind what we're trying to achieve? The fact that we're housing the workforce, and what does a workforce mean? But it just we need to make sure that we're not using these planner terms. We're not using these, these terms that don't make sense to any of us. It needs to make sense. It needs to be everyday words. I mean, we all feel it. We feel the affordability crisis. Our children aren't going to be able to afford homes, or they're not going to be able to buy a home. The American dream is out of reach for so many people. So this is what we do. We did a playbook. We partnered with Zillow to create what we call the Build the Middle playbook. And we've utilized case studies from around the country, from around the world, on what it takes to pass successful campaigns in order to, and not only that, but how do you pass effective policies that actually result in homes being built. So that is something that we are using as a tool to work with cities and states from around the country to have a conversation about where are we in the process, what's next, and how do we frame the right coalition, how do we create the right messaging and the right policies in order to ensure that legislation actually turns into homes being built. And we see what we've seen in Austin, and I know that all of you are experiencing the affordability crisis, but you are such a case study for what happens if you add more units. Prices go down. If you actually have more supply, prices go down, and this is what we've been trying to tell communities around the country, and we use Austin as a case study. And I know it's just the beginning. There's more work to do. So that is what we do, how we do it.
So let me ask you one. You have seen what was one of the tools that you use? It's one thing to pass the legislation to say, you know, you can use ADU. But for a lot of folks, well, I don't know how to use it, or that doesn't apply to me, that maybe it's for another neighborhood, et cetera. What did y'all do to help inform folks and give folks some tools so they can actually use or at least be informed about the many different ways that the legislation could be used?
Yeah, and let me go back to your earlier question first, which is, what does an ADU even mean? In California, we've kind of used ADUs to mean a lot of things. It's kind of a sneaky way of ensuring that more homes are being built. And when we think of plexes, we think of different things. We're using ADU ordinances to do that. We have places like San Diego that has gone above and beyond state laws. In cities the city of San Diego is allowed to build an unlimited amount of ADUs if the lot permits, as long as for every deed restricted ADU, you can build a market rate ADU. So if the lot permits, you can build an unlimited amount of ADUs. That's been great for actually meeting housing goals, which I'll talk about later, which is really key. But it's also created a lot of backlash because incremental change is really key. I think that's one of our strategies that we always preach, is that especially when it comes to zoning reform, that's really key. And we're working towards that because of the backlash around that. We've seen it's prevented us to do more housing. But I just wanted to say ADUs there's a lot of different ways of looking at what it actually looks like at the end, but using that term. But let me go back to your question. So we believe that passing legislation is the first step. You remove barriers. But in order to actually see homes being built, you need to work on implementation. So we do a lot of work around helping cities and states implement the laws. We have established what we call a Casita Academy, which are workshops, online workshops that we do that are used for planners, for contractors, developers, homeowners, to help them navigate all of the changing legislation. Help them navigate, how to actually get an ADU built in your backyard. What are the financing options? Is it the right option for you? How do you navigate the city? What are the myths? How do you choose the right contractor? I mean, all of these things are critical for implementation. We also did a lot of work for developing the workforce because all of a sudden we had a new industry that we had to train. And a lot of the times it was contractors that became, for example, ADU developers that provided an amazing opportunity for emerging developers to come into the space. So we've done a lot of work to train them, but also to ensure that we're keeping our pulse on the ground on the barriers that they're facing. And our game has been an incremental game. You continue iterating and removing barriers. Don't try to do it all at once because it will fail.
Thanks. And today, 25% of the building permits are ADUs?
Are ADUs, yeah.
Awesome.
450% increase. It has been the most successful housing policy to come out of California.
So you're saying there's hope for Central Texas?
There's hope. There's hope. But I do think that statewide is a key element of that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, we'll be connecting to see how we can become part of that coalition. All right. Before I go to Audrey, if you haven't already, please use your app to add send me some questions. All right. Some of y'all were Johnny on the spot and were sending questions an hour ago, but appreciate that. Audrey. Greater Miami Housing Alliance, talk about how you all have been addressing the regional challenges. You talked a little bit about that and talked about how politics plays a role in that and how you've been trying to work through that as opposed to giving up. But talk about how you balance the needs of the various communities while maintaining coordinated effort and voice.
Yeah, so the Greater Miami Housing Alliance, Miami Homes for All, as an advocacy organization, we backbone it. So it's a broad coalition, and at MHFA, what we did was we implemented a collective impact framework to basically create a structured way to reach this common agenda of preventing homelessness and increasing affordable housing. And what we did was we said, hey, Realtor Association, hey, developers, tenant organizations, researchers, we brought the whole gambit, and we created different committees to kind of tackle a different tool, whether that was zoning, whether that was permitting, whether that was tenant rights, resident protection, preventing evictions, land use, all of these different things, right? And so we created these different committees to address very specific issues. And so we had these different committees, and we kind of brainstormed, we worked together on, what are the results that we can achieve, what is winnable in Greater Miami. And then we said, okay, now we're ready for an event. Made it cute, brought photographers, brought elected officials. We made it attractive for decision makers and stakeholders to attend and be like, I was in that room, I was there to, getting work done in the community. And so we did these events where we had panels and we had breakout groups, and what we're known for Greater Miami Housing Alliance is we always like to have a workshop portion. And each time we had a workshop portion, we had someone that had lived experience of addressing the issue specifically, whether they were an emerging developer or a tenant advocate or an attorney, whatever. They were there leading that workshop and walking the decision maker, stakeholder through how the Greater Miami Housing Alliance was moving forward in their advocacy. And it was just little steps to build consensus and build that broad coalition to have that win. So we started the Greater Miami Housing Alliance in 2020 when we released this affordable housing framework, where we identified the affordable housing gaps, we identified the various policy priorities and other research that we needed, including how many youth and families were experiencing homelessness. And when we brought all that data and the committees and these events together, it really pushed our state elected officials to respond, because they were like, hey, I have Miami-Dade, Broward, Monroe, Palm Beach counties telling me we need to change things. If I'm having this, 5 counties coming together to address this large issue, we're pushing them to respond. And so that's how we were able to coordinate all the different groups. It was a challenge for a bit. I was talking to Ashton earlier, like Austin, the state likes to not be friends with Miami because we're different from the rest of the state, right? We have significant funding resources that other counties do not have. So what do I mean by that? In Miami-Dade County, we have a local surtax program and a food and beverage tax. No other county in Florida has that. So other counties and the state, they're like, Miami, you don't need anything. You don't really need all of that, blah, 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 blah. But then, like my colleagues are saying here on this panel, what we found was that we were forcing Broward to, a lot of our workers moved to Broward. A lot of Monroe residents, Monroe workers that are in the Key West no longer live in Key West. They live in Miami-Dade. A lot of our seniors are moving out of Palm Beach and going to Broward. And so it became this regional issue that then all the state elected officials were like, oh, wait, this isn't just a Miami problem. Miami's not crazy. They're actually onto something here. Mm-hmm. And so it forced the state and the regions to cooperate with each other. Because just a few years ago, Miami-Dade and Broward, we used to, like to tussle a little bit. It was WWE down there. And so what we did was we said, okay, how do we support each other? How do we increase transportation between our different groups? So we recruited private investment, but also pushed our local county governments to create reduced bus routes between each of our counties, but also created a rapid transit train that would take 15 minutes to go from Miami-Dade to Palm Beach, which would typically take an hour and a half, 2 hours, sometimes 3, depending on traffic. And so what we did was we pooled our resources together because Miami-Dade said we had surtax and food and beverage tax, but Palm Beach was like, we don't have that. But now let's advocate for a housing bond. So Palm Beach is the only one in our state that has a housing bond, right? Broward has a very active philanthropic community that is investing in affordable housing. That Miami-Dade isn't just there yet, right? And so I think that's how we were able to, Greater Miami Housing Alliance, we were able to communicate with each other, and now we're trying to connect with Orlando, because now a lot of Miami-Dade residents in Broward and Palm Beach, now they're moving to Orlando. And a lot of our Hispanic population are moving to Orlando because they don't feel safe in Miami-Dade. And so now they're going to Orlando, and Orlando's like, hey, Miami, what are you doing? Broward, what are you doing? Why is everyone moving here? Now Orlando's now figuring out, okay, how do we change zoning to address this incoming population? And now they've built a Bright Line train station to make it easier to go between the different counties. And so we coordinated together by really just making it, having many, many conversations. In reality, we started doing a lot of these conversations and research back in 2017. None of that was implemented. None of the advocacy that we pushed for was implemented until 2022. So it took a really long time to get there, but it was worth it because we were able to connect with our different counties and then go to the state level. Yeah.
Very informative. Maybe some models for us to follow. Appreciate that. Stephen, let me come back to you. We're seeing, as you alluded to, the federal government retreating from addressing racial inequities. And so many of these punitive policies were already enacted here in Texas. Right? How do you develop a housing agenda or policies that are race conscious, right, in the environment without running afoul of the law and these governmental policies?
Well, there's essentially a federal legal framework that applies nationally that overlays any particular state specificity. Like, so for example, in California, we have Prop 209, which has prohibited in public contracting, public employment, and public university admissions, public education, any specific consideration of race. But general considerations of race have and continue to be legal. So this is a really critical and difficult nuance. As long as you are not using race as a selection criterion at the individual level, you're allowed to look at race. You can look at racial statistics, you can look at racial demographics, you can look at racial composition, you can look at racial predominance within neighborhoods. And you can actually use that inside of policy. As long as it's not what's considered invidious discrimination, intentional discrimination, you can have a race-conscious policy. Texas has race-conscious policies that are actually pro-equity, pro-integrative. The most famous example is the Texas 10% plan. Those of you in Texas probably know what this is. In the Hopwood case, the Fifth Circuit basically said no affirmative action in Texas. So what happened? Not the UT Austin Board of Regents or Admissions Committee, the legislature of Texas created a policy called the Texas 10% plan, which said every top 10% of high school graduating classes will automatically qualify for admissions to UT Austin. Now, it has subsequently been amended so that it only fills up 75% of the UT undergraduate class, which means, in fact, it's like an 8.25% policy in practice. And so the matriculating juniors get a letter. I'm not from Texas, but I've read they get a letter, in the fall that says you need to hit this mark in your class to be able to be admitted. That is a race-conscious policy. It was designed to promote racial integration at UT Austin, based upon an understanding that you have segregated school districts in this state. You have predominantly black districts, predominantly Hispanic districts, and predominantly white districts. So it actually channels that segregation to create diversity. That is allowed. The Supreme Court recently rejected an appeal for cert out of, I believe it was Pennsylvania or somewhere in the Northeast, where a where a school district had applied a similar geographic consideration. So that is not going to be challenged, despite what's happened with affirmative action in Harvard and UNC. So general race consciousness, consideration of race, aggregation of statistics, examination of disparities, tracking of disparities, or general programs that use proxies or correlates, and I'm putting proxies in scare quotes here, those are broadly permitted. Broadly permitted. And nothing that the Supreme Court says, and certainly nothing this administration says, actually changes the law on that.
So we can use race-conscious policies, rationale, as we address housing affordability and housing
Absolutely.
issues.
You're allowed to have race consciousness in your policy. What you're not allowed to do is use race as a selection criterion at the individual level. So you can look at racial demographics at the neighborhood level. If you want to invest more, okay, look at LIHTC, right? I wrote a brief to the Supreme Court in the Inclusive Communities case, and we had data that showed that like over 80 to 90% of the LIHTC units that were in Dallas metropolitan area were going into predominantly non-white communities. You're allowed to actually redirect LIHTC into higher opportunity, more affluent communities in order to create racial integration. That's a policy we've actually pushed successfully in California. And a lot of critics will say, you're taking away affordable housing to low-income communities. You look at LIHTC, it's still predominantly in low-income communities. It's just balancing it so that, again, we can create more racial integration instead of using federal funds to reify segregation. So it's there. You can use race consciousness as a layer to consider how your policies have racial impacts, disparate racial impacts. It's perfectly permitted. You'd have to have a fair housing attorney come in and say there's a disparate racial impact and there's a whole set of, you can justify it through Title VIII. In general, race consciousness is broadly permitted. In fact, it already happens. Think about gerrymandering. When state legislatures do racial gerrymandering, they look at racial demographics, and the court has said as long as race is not a predominant factor in racial gerrymandering, it's basically the courts are not going to intervene. So you're allowed to use race-conscious policies at the local level, the state level, to solve these problems. And in fact, the state of Texas has done that.
Thank you very much for that. All right, time is running down on us. We could stay here for hours. Audrey, let me come back to you. One of the things that you're doing there in Florida is also addressing homelessness, all right, and tenant needs, right? It's not just ownership, so appreciate that. The coalition that you helped create requires significant, or dealing with some of these issues requires significant financial resources. So what steps have you taken to ensure that there's adequate funding available to address these issues? And of course, I'm talking about your affordable housing initiative.
So there are, I mentioned earlier, there are two major resources for funding affordable housing and homelessness efforts in Miami-Dade. There's the surtax program, which is a documentary stamp tax that a portion of all those taxes goes towards building affordable housing for 120% AMI and below for homeownership and multifamily. And then there is the food and beverage tax. So again, Miami's a party city. Every time you go out in Miami and you go to a bar that has a liquor license and makes over a certain amount, a penny of every single bill goes towards homeless programs and services. And so because there is a lack of units, permanent supportive housing or affordable housing units in general, what these two funds are doing now is dedicating more and more resources for development. And so providing, going towards acquiring buildings. So our local continuum of care is now in the practice of buying up buildings and using the food and beverage tax money to acquire and build and rehab those buildings for PSH units or other kinds of affordable housing units. So, but with that, there is still a shortage in Miami-Dade and in the greater Miami area. And so what we've done is Palm Beach is doing their housing bond, but what we're trying to provide is more incentives through the state for development. And so some of the things that we've thought creatively on is that there are some issues with it, but what we've decided is that, hey, how about we provide tax incentives as long as any development that happens in Florida if you want this tax break, if you want this incentive, 10% of your units have to be affordable. And so a lot of developers are using that, but the issue is there's a time limit. In order to access those affordable units, you only have 30 days. Doesn't really work. But I think that's a creative solution. But now what we're doing is kind of raising awareness that 30 days is simply not enough. And so, like we're saying here, it's the legislation is just the first step. Yeah. It's how do we change the implementation to make it actually work. And so this policy was implemented years ago, and so now what we're doing is figuring out the kinks and improving them so that way it truly is affordable, especially for that 60% AMI and below. Because in Florida, and I'm sure it's similar here, we can't it's really challenging to talk about affordable housing because a lot of our decision makers and stakeholders don't want to, right? There is this lack of focus on 60% AMI and below because it's believed that they should just pick themselves up by the bootstraps. They don't really need affordable housing. We have LIHTC, we have all these programs, we have food and beverage, blah, 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 blah. And so what we had to think creatively about what other funding sources we could use.
All right. Let me go to some of the questions from the audience. How do we account for the right of return and historical displacement when developing regional housing policy? This seems particularly relevant when considering the regional geography of opportunity. How can we better distribute opportunity, focusing on neighborhood revitalization rather than shuffling people in a way that reinforces segregation? And sort of what you were talking about earlier, Stephen, as far as just, and you, Noerena, the problem just sort of moving from one county to another. It's Audrey, you also talked about that. So who wants to go first on that?
I'll go first real quick. One of the things that I think California has also done successfully, again, I want to apologize, but there are things that are moving for for the impact that California has had on Texas. But I do want to reiterate that we've done some pretty innovative things in California that we're very proud of. That one of the things that we've done is that we've created a needs assessment. So it's called RENA assessment that every jurisdiction has to provide in terms of how many units they have to provide to meet the goals. Because if just one city addresses the housing supply crisis, it's not enough because there's regional implications to our housing crisis. And so different jurisdictions have different RENA goals, and there is an enforcement mechanism. So the Department of Justice and our Department of Housing and Community Development do tie resources, monies to jurisdictions if they don't meet their RENA goals. And that has been critical for different cities and counties that usually don't do this unless there's an incentive or a stick associated with it to ensure that there are affordable housing needs, capital A affordable housing needs, market rate, home ownership, all of the various different categories that they're meeting the needs of the population. And that's been an incredibly successful strategy.
Steve.
So I had RENA in one of my slides, so I pulled it up. What RENA does is it disaggregates into 5 different income levels, which is a much more sophisticated, sort of nuanced version of what is typically labeled fair share policies. And Mount Laurel being sort of the origin of these fair share policies, I don't have time to get into it right here. Let me just reframe the question. There's basically been a debate for 50 years now about whether you do mobility strategies or in-place strategies. You could even take it back to the TVA and the New Deal. And what the evidence shows overall, in my opinion, is that mobility strategies are more overall successful, but they're harder to scale up. You can't move everyone who lives in a low opportunity community to a high opportunity community. So what you really should be doing is you should be connecting people to opportunity where they are. If they're in a sort of gentrifying, improving community, the goal should be to preserve and keep them in place. If they're in a place that's really just extraordinarily low opportunity, low safety, very harmful to be in, and they want to move, then you should be able to facilitate that move. To me, the goal is to connect people to opportunity wherever it is. If that means in-place strategies, then use that. If that means mobility, then use that. There's a whole literature on mobility, moving to opportunity from the 1990s. There's a more recent one called Creating Moves to Opportunity out of Seattle, run by Raj Chetty. You can just Google CMTO and read about that. These have been very successful policies, but again, they're really hard to take to scale. They're expensive. They require housing counseling, all sorts of other supports to facilitate it. But in my opinion, it depends on what you are trying to solve. Again, if you are trying to solve for segregation and the fair housing problem, you're going to have a different kind of conceptualization than if you're just trying to solve for the lack or shortage of affordable housing, or even more acutely, homelessness, right? Like, if you're trying to solve for homelessness, it's really hard to think about, is integration the goal? But if you're thinking from a broader perspective about structural racism, systemic racial inequality, then that's a very important consideration. It depends what you're trying to do.
Yeah. All right. Folks are here, right? The mission was, let's talk about regional action to address housing affordability and affordable housing. You have 30 seconds to give folks something they can take home. It's a highlight of what it is they should do for anyone here locally says, how can I connect with regional partners to make a collective impact?
Well, there's sort of a whole slate of, you could call it regional governance. I like to call it fiscal regionalism. I think fiscal regionalism is a more realistic and attainable goal. The one example I'll just put here, which I have, is the Twin Cities policy, which is the Twin Cities Regional Tax Sharing Agreement that was put in place in 1971 and took effect in 1975. And what that does is it pools annual revenue growth. So it starts the baseline in 1975, and then all tax revenue growth that's generated in that 7-county region is then pooled and shared. And what that does is it means you don't have as many winners and losers. So the sort of more affluent, wider jurisdictions don't pull away from the rest of the region. It's all shared. And studies have shown that regional fiscal inequality is much less in the region than it otherwise would have been. It's been a tremendously successful policy, and it's one that should be looked at among other tools like regional housing agencies, COGS, so on and so forth.
Awesome. Okay. Noerena.
It's important to work together, I think, through every single mechanism possible, whether it be city planners to ensure that we have activist city planners that are sharing notes with one another. It's the advocacy organizations. We are borrowing ideas from Austin. Folks are borrowing ideas from California. We're borrowing ideas from everywhere. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. We all have to work together. If we're going to ensure that low to moderate income folks are able to build these units in their backyards, we need to figure out financial products, an actual financial ecosystem to ensure that there's liquidity out in the market for people to be able to access loans to build these units. That requires all of us working together throughout the country on working with the GSEs, working with FHA in order to allow for more permissible policies that allow for products to emerge in the ecosystem and work to become a catalyst for the private sector to step in as well. All of that is only going to be done together by sharing stories. I mean, we're trying to copy what Austin did with the ADU condos because we have no starter homes in California. So we are trying to work statewide in coalition because we passed a bill removing the prohibition, because we had a prohibition to do that statewide. So now we're working with cities to opt in, and that all is just coordinating. It's the only way we're going to make any sort of advances. We're not working in silos.
Audrey?
So in Miami-Dade County, what we're trying to do is, one, invest and share resources with one another to build the leadership of young people with lived experience of housing instability, because they're the best leaders in centering what it is that we need to fix around homelessness, because there is a pipeline of youth in the foster care system, youth in other systems experiencing homelessness, and they become the ones experiencing chronic homelessness, as well as providing training and workshops and power building essentially, and investing in the leadership development of tenant and residents. tenants and residents, so that way they are the ones that are meeting with elected officials and other stakeholders to share their stories and share the data and say, hey, here's how we can address it. And then also investing in the technical assistance and leadership development of emerging developers and minority-led developers, because they are the ones that are doing the hard work of addressing middle housing, right?
Yeah.
Because they're the ones that are building those small-scale, medium-scale developments that a lot of times the powers that be ignore, right? But they're the ones that have to navigate zoning issues, permitting issues, et cetera. So we invest in them and we partner with them. What we've done is collect, when we get big grants, we sub-grant to these emerging developers and to tenant groups and to others and agencies and nonprofits that are supporting leadership development programs. So that way we collectively can work together. And that's how we were able to move a lot of our advocacy efforts. It's just really investing in leadership and power building.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Some of the things you all have talked about, we're doing some of those things here, but there's still a lot more we could do. You may have heard the mayor earlier, and I think Avais talked about, we have the emerging, or we call it a little different, but the small developers program, et cetera. The second year is kicking off soon. But you have challenged us to do more. You've challenged us to allow this not to be just an academic exercise and coming together and talking about regional, but what can we do from when we leave from this place, et cetera. You've left us some tools. You said that we can connect with you afterwards, et cetera. And so we're hoping that, and I challenge my colleagues here in this room, that we actually do some things once we leave this place so that we can actually make some changes in our region affecting affordable housing and housing affordability. Can we put our hands together for Stephen, Noerena, and Audrey?